Good morning, friends. Welcome back to Azamanthikathanya TV. So a lot of people were asking me some questions about the Swampbuster ruling by a federal court at the end of last month. And here's personal perspective on this, and then I'm going to get into the topic that I do want to talk about. But so the Swampbuster ruling was by the federal court. The reason why they ruled against it is because the farmer doesn't necessarily have a constitutional right to collect money from the federal government under it's subsidy programs. It's not like a guaranteed right that they have. And I personally am not a big fan of subsidies. They create unfair competition and often put people ahead in the competition who haven't earned it by merit. And that's just a personal perspective of mine. I don't think that subsidies are a great way to go. And the one thing you have to remember is that anytime you take money from the federal government, you have to play by the federal government's rule book. So the Swampbuster just basically says that if something is designated a farmland by the federal government, you cannot farm it, or if you do, we're going to cut you out of the insurance programs, we're going to cut you out of a lot of the subsidy programs coming from the federal government. You can't rely on us if you're not going to play by our rules. And that's basically, in a nutshell, what happened with that Swampbuster case. Like I said, if you're going to take money from the federal government, you are at their mercy, pretty much. And if you don't want to be at their mercy, don't take their money and their programs. It's as simple as that. But there are a lot of conflicting issues when it comes to wetland designation, streams, rivers, and in some cases, see, they were trying to argue that it was the taking of property by eminent domain without compensation, but it wasn't. They weren't taking the property. They were simply taking away the farmers' rights to subsidies if they chose to farm the property. But across the United States, there are a lot of issues with landowners around these water areas where they're not allowed at all, or they can face criminal penalties for farming the land or for fencing the land off. That is something that I am not okay with. And especially since some of these wetlands are, their definition of what a wetland is pretty laughable at the federal level. I think that is something that people need to appeal to their legislators about, to have some clear definition on, because it seems as though the agencies often use it as an excuse to stop people from farming. But to stop somebody from subsidies, which was the Swampbuster ruling that recently came out, I don't necessarily think that they had a strong case there, because they are taking money from the federal government. But what I do want to talk about today is an interesting concept: state-sanctioned trespass. Should somebody be allowed to trespass on a farm or a ranch because of unnavigable waters? Waters that you can navigate would include normally rivers, ponds. If you're on the side of a lake, people have the right to go on those waters. And if you've ever canoed down a river, I have, or fly fished, you know that if the water can be navigated by boat, it's generally okay that you go down that stream or river. As a fly fisherman, if I am going through an area where I know there's private property on either side of me, I stay in the water. I don't get out, I don't walk along the bank, because that is private property, it's private land. People shouldn't be allowed to go on it. And I fully agree with that. I don't think that we should be getting out and walking along the banks of somebody else's property. The water is one place, the banks are another. But what happens if they start to say that streams are maybe just a few inches deep, are navigable waters to the public? It's something that has come up in North Carolina, in New Mexico, it's come up across the United States. And they've been ruling that these streams are navigable waters. You can maybe, I don't know, maybe you could stand on a board and go down some of them. Of course, I think you'd hit some rocks. But if the stream connects to a lake or a river, then it should be open to the public. Now, this is causing a lot of problems. Could you imagine somebody coming up a stream that runs through a bison pasture And then suddenly you've got this situation where ranchers are going to have to fence off those streams, and then they're going to extend that buffer they always do to, you know, the riparian areas around the streams and pretty much take out a bunch of grazing land. That's my fear of it. And the other thing that people don't realize is that these large ruminants and ungulates are actually extremely important to those riparian areas. There are certain frogs, certain things that depend on these animals in those areas, and they help keep those areas clean and cleared. So it's just, you know, the entire concept to me is stupid. But I'm going to give you some cases here as examples so you can see how ridiculous this is. So there's a lady in New Mexico named Lucia Sanchez. On Lucia's property, she has a bunch of small streams. Some of them are seasonal, they're not there year round, and they kind of crisscross throughout her property. And most ranchers in this part of our country depend on these types of streams to help water their livestock and keep their operations going. They depend on them for the animals. And like I said, having these large grazing ungulates along the stream banks help clear the vegetation, make the way for other animals as well. There's a direct relationship between good stewardship and wildlife that I think a lot of people overlook when it comes to ranching. They just want people to think ranchers are bad, but they're not. But in 2022, the New Mexico Supreme Court ruled that streams that are non-navigable, like you can't take a boat up them, were open to public access. And because of that, this particular ranch has seen a lot of anglers going up and down the stream banks, a lot of hikers. Now you can't, unless you're, you know, hiking in the water, technically you are trespassing. But the problem is that if this rancher approaches them, if they tell them to get off their property, suddenly they could be prosecuted by the Supreme Court or by the courts of New Mexico for harassing people on what they consider public land. So I don't know exactly what the buffer is of that. I think the ruling only actually protects the stream bed when there's water in it. This type of policy puts the animals, the livestock on the property in danger. It causes damage to fences and fence lines. It creates an enormous amount of liability issues. Somebody walking on somebody's property and gets bulldozed by a bull. And it gives the rancher, the person who has been providing maintenance and care for the property, a complete loss of control. It also creates more trash and debris that then have to be cleaned up by the property owner. So overall, this was a very poor ruling. If you can't navigate it by boat, then it's not supposed to be public access. But for whatever reason, and fly fishermen and other groups like that have fought in favor of these rules because they want to be able to go up streams on people's private property and do a little stream trout fishing. But if you don't own the property and that property is in use by somebody else with large livestock, with other operations going on, you have no business being there. There are plenty of state parks, national monuments, all sorts of places that you can go to fly fish. I am a fly fisherman, I feel you. New Mexico made this ruling under the concept that all waters in the state are public waters. And that's kind of been a lot of states have kind of accepted that water is owned by the public, not an individual. And therefore, the waterway apparently is also owned by the public. I don't necessarily believe that they go hand in hand. I think that the state of Mexico, New Mexico, could very easily have policies in place protecting the water that's running through somebody's ranch or farmland, the amount of water that they can pump out and give to their livestock. But that doesn't change the ownership of the water bed. You know, just because you have public ownership of all water does not mean you have public ownership of where all that water goes. And like I said, this is a belief system across the West. In Montana, this has been around since 1985. Montana is, a lot of people think, is one of the freest states in the world, biggest believers of property rights, but you can actually hike up any old stream in Montana through somebody else's property, and it's perfectly legal. In California, they've interpreted the laws to protect these non-navigable waters as well. In Colorado, the courts have taken a little bit more of a narrower stance, often siding with the landowners, but they still recognize, you know, some public access under some circumstances. Of course, in North Carolina and Arkansas, these are questions that have come up in recent years, but they still require that the waterway be navigable or at least connected to a main water source. So I think that this is an interesting topic because it directly impacts somebody's private use of their land. And I think that we have a lot of natural resources that flow across people's lands. It doesn't necessarily mean that that gives people the right to come in and disturb their property, disturb their land, and cause potentially harm or damage to their property. But the ability to navigate up and down stream beds, you can't even float a raft down or a tube down, versus, I guess, kind of throwing a fit that you can't get subsidies and federal insurance if you farm some cropland that has a potential flood zone on it, are two very different things, in my perspective, when it comes to property rights, when it comes to personal liberties. Anyway, guys, that was just a quick video to answer a question that somebody had and why I hadn't covered that topic. And, you know, the types of topics that I do think have an impact on farmers and ranchers. When it comes to water, when it comes to these waterways, when it comes to determining what is a wetland and what is not, it depends on, you know, what the situation that we're talking about. Is it preventing you from getting access to taxpayer funds, or is it a situation where it is actually impacting your rights to use that land, where it's bringing trespassers onto your property? And there are a lot of cases where wetland designations have, you know, legally prevented farmers, you know, criminally from being able to do anything with their property. I've done videos on that on this channel. And those are the types of cases too, where I think that if we went back and looked at what determines these areas that are, you know, that hardly ever have water in them to be, you know, watersheds, I think there has to be some more clarity on that. And that would help resolve some of these situations with farmers wanting to get subsidies. So anyway, guys, those are my 2 cents for today. Have a good week and stay tuned in for more here on Llanas TV.
Ancient eras and natural selection have refined and tailored pristine fibers with the resilience for today's days. Evolving beyond the last ice age, bison wool is nature's most dependable activewear. Buffalo Wool Company, 100% proven by nature, 100% American made.
Check out the Buffalo Wool Company collection at yanasatradingco.com.